In 1858, an article was published in an obscure journal, co-authored by a couple of men who were at the time called, I guess you would call them naturalists. They were not men who held degrees in science or biology or geology, but they were naturalists, amateurs. One was named Charles Darwin, and the other was named Alfred Wallace. Darwin and Wallace had come up independently with the same idea. They took an idea from Reverend Malthus, first promoted in 1798, of the expansion of the species, any species, up against its biological limits. The enormous multiplication of species, and yet many, many deaths. And the two of them, independently, came to a conclusion that this was how change biologically takes place. This is the basis of what they called evolution, and Darwin made famous evolution through natural selection. It published in the Journal of the Linnean Society, and the article sank without a trace. The next year, Darwin convinced his publisher that he should do a book on this process of evolution through natural selection. The publisher really didn't want to do it. He wanted him to do a book on pigeons, but it didn't sell as far as Darwin was concerned, so he said, no, I want to do this book. And so he did, and it was published towards the end of the year, 1859. The whole edition sold out. There weren't many copies. There were under 1,500 copies, but booksellers bought it, hoping that it would sell. And one of those peculiar events of life took place which changed everything. The book was sent by the London Times to a reviewer, and the Times was then as now one of the great spokes outlets, not spokesperson, but spokes outlet of the establishment. It spoke for the establishment, so its book reviews made a difference. The reviewer got the book, looked at the book, read a little bit of the book, and sent the book back. Said, I'm not qualified to review this thing. So as a second best measure, the guy who was in charge of the book review section of the paper sent it to a man named Thomas Huxley. Huxley read it, understood its implications, and devoted the remainder of his life to a defense of it, and that carried down well into the mid-20th century in terms of his heirs. The Huxleys became the great defenders of Darwinism. And Huxley, who became known as Darwin's bulldog, began to publicize the concept of evolution through natural selection. In 1871, the next installment came out, The Descent of Man, in which Darwin actually did say that man had evolved down through the ages through some kind of an ape-like creature. He did not say it in The Origin of Species. He did say it in The Descent of Man. By 1880, that is within 20 years of the time that Darwin published his book, had his book published at least, that idea had swept Western European thought, Anglo-American thought. That idea was becoming dominant not just in biology and geology, but in law, in the concept of social theory, certainly in the concept of religion. That idea of evolution through natural selection in a 20-year period virtually conquered the intellectual world of the West. I can't think of anything in the history of human thought that had a more rapid penetration within the intellectual class than the concept of evolution through natural selection. And it was Darwin who did it. In certainly the 1870s, began a concept of social development which was tied to this Darwinian viewpoint. And it was called, in retrospect, social Darwinism. Social Darwinism was simply the application of the idea of evolution through natural selection without God, without a directing agency, simply through competition, that the best would survive. And there was a phrase that we know today called the survival of the fittest. Now that phrase actually was coined before the publication of The Origin by a man we call sociologist today, no such thing in those days. His name was Herbert Spencer. Spencer coined the phrase, and Darwin picked it up in a later edition of The Origin of Species, the survival of the fittest. And that idea began to spread, though not as rapidly as Darwin spread, but as a sub-classification of Darwinism. That idea began to spread. There is no God. At least there's no God directing anything. There is competition, and that through competition, nature enables the most fit individuals to survive. That was then translated into not just nature, but the economy. That the economy functioned as nature functioned with animals, the economy functions with man. And that man, through competition within a free market social order, will advance the species by means of profit and loss, by means of survival, by means of success and failure. And you think, well, that's a radical idea. No, actually, that's not a radical idea. That, in fact, is what Adam Smith had been teaching in 1776. That is what Scottish Enlightenment rationalism taught. That's what David Hume taught. Hume was basically an atheist. Smith was a deist. But Hume was an atheist. Now, they didn't tie it to biology. They tied it to social progress, social competition, the survival of the profitable way of doing things. In other words, the pursuit of self-interest individually leads to successes, and the failures are unprofitable, and they fall by the wayside, and society step by step gets wiser, richer, more productive through market competition. In fact, Darwin's idea came from Scottish rationalism. That's where the origin of the whole evolution idea in terms of natural selection came from. Not in terms of saying there was no mechanism for it in 1801. He discovers the mechanism, or the way biologically that it takes place in terms of the competition of species for survival space. So he's talking about species, but all of this as an idea had come from the mid-18th century. And it just gets incarnated in the scientific world through Darwinism, and then back to social development through what I would call the right-wing social Darwinists, the most famous being Herbert Spencer, but also you had others who were great defenders of it. It was a powerful idea for a time, held by a lot of intellectuals. Not a majority of them, but certainly a group of them. William Graham Sumner was another. The idea that through social evolution, social competition, you advance society without the interference of government, and that this is comparable to nature, which doesn't care who wins, doesn't have a planning agency, doesn't have any way of forecasting the future, doesn't understand the future, is impersonal. What nature does to species, the free market does to individuals and companies. And so this becomes a defense of the free market social order, not based on moral philosophy, as Adam Smith would have wanted to have it defended, but based on what appeared to be the most advanced scientific breakthrough, that is, biological evolutionism. It was not Christian. It was not conservative in the sense of appealing to historic laws, appealing to common law decisions. And in the general population, it really was not that widely believed. But certain individuals did believe it and defended the free market in terms of it. This was right-wing social Darwinism. And it began to spread in the 1870s, and it continued to spread for probably another 30 years. And you can't call it socially conservative, except insofar as it defends the idea of private property. That, as a conservative doctrine, yes. But the motivation is not conservative. It's overthrowing the past. It's overthrowing the way we do things now. It's let's find a better way to do it. It's a way of transforming society so that you can do this to the benefit of man, but without central planning, as long as you have the private property social order. You don't need God. You don't need morality. All you need is open competition and free entry. That's all you need. That's the Darwinist case. Certainly it's not something that the church has picked up rapidly. In this country, you had taken the church out of politics, certainly by the 1830s. The church was no longer openly partisan. It was no longer part of the political order. There was a compromise that had been made. Certainly the compromise was implicit in the Constitution, Article 6, Section 3, in which it said that no federal officer can be required to take a test oath as the basis of holding office. And by 1831, the last state that had any kind of funding for the church, Massachusetts, abolished that funding. So the churches were officially out of the political process. So there was still Christianity, but the political parties were not going to appeal openly to one political or ecclesiastical group or another. Now, of course, in fact, they did. Democrats were usually associated with the Catholic Church and vice versa, but it wasn't much talked about. All groups in America associated what I would call the American creed. It's difficult to get a creed down to describe one society across the board in a couple of words. In fact, you'd say, well, that's impossible. But I'll do it in 8 words. 8 words for the American creed. Live and let live. Let's make a deal. The idea of individual liberty, so long as you don't tread on my toes, and the idea that we can work out a profitable arrangement, those 2 ideas describe America almost from the time that they got off the boat in the early 17th century, and certainly from 1800 onward. And Americans believe in competition. They believe in the idea that you can have social order, benefits for all individuals, and also benefits for the collective by trade and by productivity and hard work and thrift. Those are basic American ideas. And so the social Darwinist positions seem to be consistent with the American creed. But there was another side to social Darwinism, and it begins to appear in the 1880s. And this position says, we are not animals. Yes, we are biologically, but there's been a leap of being, and man is something better, something more advanced, something more scientific. And the free market can't be trusted because it is like nature, and nature has no planning, and man now, because he has scientific tools of planning, can begin to direct society. And they did it on the basis of Darwinism. They took the idea that man advances as a species. And they took the idea of evolution through natural selection, and they took the idea of scientific training and scientific methodology, and they said, now man has made a leap of being. Now man can direct the process. Economically, politically, educationally, a group of trained central planners, of trained scientists committed to Darwinism, these individuals can begin to direct the society from Washington and then down through the states. This new social order of progress and advancement will be possible through scientific planning. And that becomes the basic organizational idea of what was known as the progressive movement. And the progressive movement begins to take off in the 1880s, especially among educated people, people who'd gone to college, who saw themselves as different from their peers. The progressive movement begins to accelerate the idea of central planning, not in the sense of massive socialism, that's not part of the American tradition, but in the sense of the mixed economy, in the sense of scientific planning, of regulation by the central government. This is part of the progressive movement. It is Darwinian. It is not based on Christianity. It is not based on the Bible. It is based on the idea that man is now leaped ahead of all other creatures. And they wouldn't call them creatures because that implies creator. But man has leaped ahead of the other species through his brain, through the power of his brain, and through the power of social cooperation, and through the power of taxation, and the power of central planning by way of the courts. Mankind can now begin to take control of mankind and direct the paths of evolution, social evolution, along a more profitable, more guaranteed, more rational basis. And so you see the beginning of this organization. You have the creation of the Interstate Commerce Commission in 1886, the first great national regulatory agency. They're going to regulate transport. And the expansion then of regulatory agencies begins. And all of it's justified in terms of Darwinism. If it's justified in terms of anything at all, certainly not justified effectively in terms of Christianity. And then even that changes, because almost simultaneously you have the rise of what we call the social gospel. And the social gospel movement begins to reinterpret Christianity to make it consistent with the progressive movement. And that what we need is more government agencies doing more moral things with the money that people have. We need moral government. We need rational government. And so the moral government is pushed by the social gospel movement, which arises almost at the same time as the progressive movement, and the rational planning movement, that is the progressive movement. They're pushing it in terms of politics. And so you have a combination of these two joined ideas of central planning, and this becomes, in the 20th century, what we call liberalism. Not classical liberalism, not 19th century liberalism, not Adam Smith liberalism, but political liberalism that we recognize today in terms of central planning, more government regulation, more taxation, more direction of the economy. This becomes the advent then in the 1880s of what today becomes modern political liberalism. And it's against that, and in opposition to that, and in comparison to that, that you have what we now know today as the American conservative movement. And I'll be getting into the implications of that in the next section.